virus that causes that. That's a common example of a syndrome. So irritable bowel syndrome, we don't know what causes it, essentially. But basically what it is it's a complex of symptoms, right? So it's the feel-bads. My belly bloats, it aches, I have irregular bowel habits, sometimes it's diarrhea, sometimes it's constipation, nothing's wrong. Usually people have had it forever, and it's bothersome, and it really becomes a quality of life issue. By definition, irritable bowel syndrome is not caused by another digestive disease. It is sort of a thing in and of itself. And we think it has something to do with the way that the body's nervous system communicates with the bowel, both in the way it receives messages from the bowel and the way that it sends messages to the bowel to tell it how to move it. And we know that stress seems to play a large part in IBS. People commonly, will report, oh, whenever I'm going to go on a vacation, or I'm going to go on a long car ride, or I'm going to go on a plane ride, or something like that, it really tends to act up. I hear a lot about people eating out, and I think a lot of that not only has to do with the food that people are eating that they're maybe not as used to when they eat out, but also that sense of lack of control, basically. You're going to be out generally with friends or family in, sort of an unknown place where the food is going to be different, and people get nervous that they're going to need to go to the bathroom, and that sometimes can even worsen the matter, and so people can sort of get into this sort of cyclical problem of worried about their bowels, and then it only makes the problems worse. Generally, irritable bowel syndrome comes on before the age of 50. If these kinds of symptoms have never been an issue and then they come on after the age of 50, it really requires an evaluation to make sure that this is truly IBS that we're dealing with and not some other cause, such as medication side effect or other disease. You can get IBS after 50, but it requires evaluation.
Any studies on weather-related, hot, some winters being worse than summers, etc.? Changing seasons?
I only have anecdotal experience with that or knowledge of that. I don't know if there's been studies, but I do hear that quite a bit. People will say every winter I feel this way.
Worse and better during the summer.
Yeah.
Is it an illness that's also typical in young kids?
Quite. Mm-hmm. Quite. Yeah. I don't treat kids, but early teens is when a lot of this stuff comes on.
Any studies with connections to gluten?
So gluten is probably a lecture series in and of itself. There's something called celiac disease, which is how gluten kind of got its name in terms of popular culture. That's basically a condition where the body's immune system attacks the gut in response to gluten. When we take biopsies of the lining of the intestines, we see changes under the microscope where things aren't forming correct, a lot of inflammation. There's another entity called gluten sensitivity, which is basically when people feel rotten after eating gluten. But there's actually no changes that we see either to the naked eye when we look at the intestines or when we take biopsies and look at them under the microscope. So there is sort of a sensitivity issue there, so you could maybe make a connection between irritable bowel syndrome and gluten sensitivity. I think ultimately, if I were to predict, I think gluten sensitivity is going to be known by a different name eventually, just like celiac disease wasn't always recognized as its own problem. We just, in my opinion, I think need the lab test to sort of prove it, so to speak, and that's in development.
Does dairy products have a lot to do with?
It's similar to sort of the gluten sensitivity thing. There's something called lactose intolerance, and we all naturally are supposed to be born with the ability to digest the sugar lactose, which is in milk, as babies, of course, because it's in breast milk. But as we age, we're not really genetically engineered to drink milk. Certainly not cow's milk, right? And so we all naturally make less and less lactase, which is the enzyme that digests lactose, which is in milk. And so when you don't digest it properly, it stays in the gut. It pulls all kinds of water in with it. If you guys remember osmosis from your chemistry days, if you have sugar without water, it wants to pull water in with it, and it leads to diarrhea and bloating. And so I kind of consider lactose intolerance just part of being human. It's just what it means. And different people have different sensitivities to lactose. Some are able to tolerate a little, some a lot. Some can have it with breakfast but not with lunch, twice in a row. So, how do we treat irritable bowel syndrome? Stress reduction is really huge. Exercise, again, is important, basically trying to find healthy ways of dealing with stress. Things like this, with community support is important. We have medications that treat irritable bowel syndrome, like antispasm medicines. These are basically anti-diarrhea medications. Fiber supplements, I know it's unusual that I'm using the same product to treat both constipation and diarrhea problems, but it turns out it can add a little bit of bulk to the stool and can kind of reduce that urgent feeling that people can get.
Question. Many years ago they used Librex. Is that
Yeah, that's an
still-
antispasmodic medication.
You still use that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't prescribe that one a whole lot, but that's, people do. That one's out there, yeah. Diverticulosis and diverticulitis. This is essentially kind of another thing that just goes along with being human. I kind of liken it, it's like gray hair of the colon. It just happens. Basically, what happens is the colon starts to get kind of weak, and it starts to bow out on the sides a little bit, and you form these little pockets here, and we call these diverticuli, and we call the condition diverticulosis. When these pockets, most of the time, this is completely asymptomatic. We'll tell people all the time you have diverticulosis, and people are shocked because usually there's no symptoms at all. When these things get infected, that's called diverticulitis. So diverticulosis and diverticulitis are two different things. In order to get the infections, the itis, you have to have the pockets in the first place. You have to have the osis. So probably 95% of the people in this room have diverticulosis. It's incredibly common, and it's not anything to worry about per se. We do make some recommendations about ways to keep the colon healthy and to reduce the amount of diverticulosis that we develop, and that is primarily fiber supplements and, again, a healthy diet, 20 to 30 grams of fiber a day. The itis part, we don't have any great ways to actually avoid diverticulitis. I'll talk about that in a second. But this is basically what it looks like inside if I were to put a camera inside of the colon of someone who has this. And these are sort of the openings to those pockets that you saw on the previous slide.
That's exterior to the colon?
This is inside the colon. So this is as if you were looking inside a tunnel. And these are the openings to the pockets, and these are sort of the outsides of them. Like
So
as
the
if you were
sac
looking
is on
in
the outside,
this
the
way.
opening is interior?
Yeah, exactly. It's all communicating.
Okay.
It's like little caves. I hope this is okay to mention, but it's kind of gross. This is basically a lump of stool that actually got lodged inside one of those pockets. And what happens is when people take the colonoscopy prep, these things can kind of become dislodged. But you could see how someone could get infections in that area because, debris can sort of get lodged in there.
What's the causative factor of these pockets forming?
What happens is the colon is lined by muscle,
Right.
and that muscle basically just gets weak with time, and it sort of gives way to the pressure inside the colon from the work it does all the time is squeezing, and it just starts to bow outward. It's just stress over time, basically. These little pockets, because they kind of bow outward, they get a little bit thin, and sometimes the blood vessel will rupture into them, and it can bleed. It's called bleeding diverticulum. And this is not the kind of blood that, I saw on the toilet paper one time. This is the kind of bleeding that brings people to the emergency room. And, there's also not a great way to avoid that. So, a couple things to clear up about diverticulosis and diverticulitis. One is we used to tell everybody that you shouldn't eat seeds and nuts and berries, and how many people have heard that before? Yeah. And so they tried to prove that. So they did this study where they gave a certain number of people popcorn to eat who had diverticulosis, and they gave the other people, a diet that was very strict and to avoid seeds and nuts, etc. And what they were trying to do is basically prove that the people who ate the popcorn actually got more diverticulitis over time. Well, lo and behold, what happened is the people in the popcorn group actually had a little bit less bouts of diverticulitis. And they've gone back and looked at this since, and it turns out that there's really not a great connection between dietary avoidance of seeds and nuts and that sort of thing and reduced chances of getting diverticulitis, unfortunately. Because the natural question, of course, is, well, what can I do to prevent diverticulitis? And as of right now, there's no answer to that question, as a matter of fact, other than prayer. And when people get recurrent bouts of diverticulitis again and again and again, really the only way to truly prevent that from happening again is to actually have the part of the colon that keeps getting infected removed, which is of course not what any of us want to have done. So the verdict is out. They're doing a lot of studies to try to come up with some way of avoiding diverticulitis, but as of right now, it's just one of those things that is important to treat early when it happens, but not a whole lot of ways to avoid.
Now, does that show up when a colonoscopy is done?
The diverticulosis
Yes.
does.
It does show up pretty clearly.
Can the pouching actually heal and reduce or not?
No.
No.
So it's a bit like having 6 fingers. You got it, and you got it. You know, it's a part of your body. So you can have it removed, but there's no pill that's going to make it go away. It's basically